Thank you very much indeed, Mrs Hale, and it's always very enjoyable to follow the Honourable Member for Wolverhampton South West, who I almost feel like calling my honourable friend, given that I seem to be spending more time with him than some of my other honourable friends in the Chamber these days. Well, I do have honourable friends here with me today, which is very welcome, of course, indeed. Mrs Hale, it is, of course, correct that Parliament should be involved in future decisions relating to the balance of decision-making between the UK and the EU, and today we must scrutinise and consider exactly the details of what the role of this Parliament should be, on how many and which decisions, but at the same time without imposing a huge bureaucratic burden that stalls any kind of process, both in this House and in the EU. And also we must recognise how Parliament should decide. Now, the discussion on exactly how Parliament should decide will indeed be further elaborated in the second group of amendments, so I do not intend to stray very much onto that territory just now. Suffice to say, I think there is some merit in the suggestions for greater scrutiny in terms of the way that Parliament decides, and some of the suggestions of an Act of Parliament being passed may indeed go some way to allay the concerns of various honourable and right honourable members who have suggested that the proposals in the bill actually give us weaker controls than currently. And in fact, an Act of Parliament would perhaps have more in common with the current treaty provisions which come through this House as an Act of Parliament. On the passerelle clause, many members have expressed concerns. The right honourable members, in particular for Wells and Chingford and Woodford, I hope I've got that right. Woodford Green, indeed. Woodford Green. Apologies to the right honourable member for getting that wrong. They warned against us seeing this as a benign clause, and they gave us the history of previous treaties where we had been told that there would be parliamentary approval. And while I do not quite agree with the extent of their scare stories, I do clearly think that Parliament should have the right to decide. And I therefore welcome the fact that the Government has actually recognised this in Clause 6(1)(a), that a Minister of the Crown may not vote in favour or otherwise support a decision under any of the following unless parliamentary approval has been given in accordance with this section, and the long list of the different areas to which that will apply. Obviously, some of the areas which are then listed are areas which are quite sensitive. I pick out in particular 6(1)(c) on common and foreign security policy, and clearly in any of such cases in future where parliamentary approval is sought, it will be incumbent on government ministers to make a very strong case as to why further moves to QMV would be appropriate. But at the same time, I do reiterate, we do not want to create, particularly on somewhat less sensitive areas, such a bureaucratic burden as to completely stall any progress within the European Union. Although I do suspect that might possibly be the very motivation behind some of the amendments on the order paper this evening, Mrs Hale. In particular, an Amendment 48 in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Wells, which proposes that every decision in the Council should actually be subject to approval in this place. And I put to the House that I think that is just a recipe for paralysis. Some members may want to see that, but I, for one, do not. And particularly the second part of that amendment makes no sense by seeking parliamentary approval for decisions which are currently subject to qualified majority voting. That would be effectively trying to reinstate the veto in those areas, which clearly is a piece of nonsense and would wreck the treaty. Turning to Amendment 286 in the name of the Honourable Member for Hemsworth, I do think we probably have generally quite different views on the benefits of market liberalisation, and I, for one, am not a fan of protectionism, although I do think that there are some areas in his amendment, particularly on health services, social housing, where we do not necessarily want European interference. But we are in a single market, and particularly when it comes to things like postal services and transport, I think that we do need to recognise that can be of benefit, and we would not want every decision on those areas having to be second-guessed by this House in addition. He did not take my intervention. I wish he had. He was only too keen to take the one from the Honourable Member for the Forest of Dean instead. I'm not quite sure what he has that I don't have. But if he had taken my intervention, what I wanted to put to him was that I don't really think, as some other Honourable Members have mentioned, that we can blame the EU for what's happened to the Post Office in this country. I think he would be far better off directing his comments to his own front bench and their undermining of the Post Offices through scrapping the pension book, through removing government services and the heavy-handed way in which they've been forcing benefit claimants to direct payments instead of using the post offices. There was an interesting part, though, I think, of his amendment, suggesting in various different parts of the amendment that, that there should be laid before Parliament a statement on the negotiating mandate. And there's been some quite interesting exchanges, I think, genuinely, on the merits or other of this. I have to say, when I first read this, similar to the honourable member for Wolverhampton South West, I was very much of the view that, you know, surely if you're going to negotiate a position, the last thing you want to do is to have all of your negotiating points laid out in public on the internet for any of your other people in the European decision-making process to be able to see exactly where your lines are. So I think there are potential problems with that, although I have to say I do like the concept of the democratic link. I think it is important to try and make sure this House has proper scrutiny, and indeed these decisions are therefore somewhat closer to our constituents. There was obviously the suggestion that while having these negotiating statements in public would be problematic, that perhaps some other procedure within this House, perhaps going to the European Scrutiny Committee and having the discussion in private, may be a way round. Although I have to say I didn't detect a great deal of enthusiasm for the honourable member for Linlithgow and Falkirk East to be receiving telephone calls from the Prime Minister at 3 a.m. in the middle of negotiating various aspects of EU policy. So maybe that isn't the exact best way forward, and there may be, I'm sure, between the brains in this House and knowledge of different parliamentary procedures, some way of finding an opportunity to have greater scrutiny of these positions without laying all of our cards on the table for our EU partners to know exactly what we're going to do. Turning to amendment number 47, again I read this initially and saw that the change in words from may not vote in favour of or otherwise support to shall vote against or otherwise reject is perhaps slightly semantic and essentially meaning the same thing, particularly because obviously the issue here is whether an abstention would allow something through, but in my mind, and I have to confess I am no lawyer, but otherwise support, if by abstaining it actually led to something being implemented into law, could that not be conceived to be otherwise supporting? However, I have to say the amendment, at least even if that is the case, and I say I'm no lawyer, does at least make it absolutely crystal clear, and so I think is perhaps worthy of support. And let's face it also, if this amendment is also listing areas which the government already recognises should only be proceeded with under parliamentary approval, then I really would be intrigued to know what objections the government has to this amendment, because it does just seem to absolutely make that crystal clear. I have to say the amendment number 18, in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Richmond, does not seem quite so sensible. Instead, to leave out... I certainly will, David.
Only just very briefly. I was listening carefully to what she was saying. Do I take it from her remarks that if Amendment 47 were to be pressed, she'd be minded and her colleagues to support it?
As I say, that certainly would be my state of mind at the moment. The Minister has not spoken and yet given us this wonderful reason why this may not be the case and why making this a bit clearer is not a good idea. So I do look forward to hearing whether he's able to convince me, but he may certainly have to work hard on that one. As I was turning to amendment number 18, to basically stop after the clause 6.1 and leave out the option of parliamentary approval for all of the different areas listed, to my reading of this, would effectively ban any future moves to qualified majority voting, any use of the passerelle, any move to ordinary legislative procedure at all in any circumstances ever, which to me does not actually seem to be very sensible and is perhaps just slightly symptomatic of the somewhat blinkered and isolationist view on Europe that today's Conservative Party seems to take, that they are unable to conceive of any circumstance in the future that any of these things might be beneficial to the UK's interest. And let's bear in mind, Mrs Hill, we cannot predict the future. If we just look at clause 6.1f, it talks about measures to do with the environment. Now, if at some future point, to help with the challenge of tackling climate change, and after subject to approval by this House, it just may be in our interest to ease future possibilities for implementing moves to protect the environment within Europe, that would be a good idea, and therefore I think Amendment 18 cannot really be taken seriously. I also have some sympathy with amendments 42 to 46, again to increase the parliamentary scrutiny on a variety of different issues, moves to qualified majority voting on criminal procedures, and indeed on the list of crimes which are covered. Now, the current list of crimes in the Treaty of Lisbon, it does seem to me to be pretty comprehensive. Terrorism, trafficking in human beings and sexual exploitation of women and children, illegal drug trafficking, illicit arms trafficking, money laundering, corruption, counterfeiting of means of payment, computer crime and organised crime. It does seem to me to be pretty comprehensive and not easy to predict what one might want to add to that, but 20 years ago we probably couldn't predict that we would have cybercrime, so if in future we did want to add a crime to that, I certainly think it would make sense for this House to have the final say on that. Like the other parties, we are not in favour of a European public prosecutor, but again, to have a safeguard that the House should decide if that was to change in the future seems to be eminently sensible. And on the amendment relating to common EU defence, well, it brought to mind very much that we haven't had the opportunity to debate that properly, which again is very much to be regretted. But again, if we were to move to QMV and in this field, it would be sufficiently a big decision, I would put, that it would require parliamentary approval. So certainly I would be minded to support any of these amendments if pressed to the vote. I was quite tempted by Amendment 49, which has parliamentary approval required for various aspects of the opt-ins to Justice and Home Affairs. My issue with this would perhaps be the practicalities of it in terms of the short window that we might have for opting into some of these provisions being 6 weeks, and that may well indeed be difficult with parliamentary timetabling. So I'm less convinced on that, although again I do welcome the spirit of it. I certainly would have.
I'm most grateful to our honourable friend for giving way, but these are actually rather crucial issues, and it does seem to me we need to make them parliamentary timetable fit the European timetable if necessary, to allow for proper scrutiny rather than just dismiss the idea of giving parliamentary approval.
Well, indeed, there may certainly be ways of ensuring that there were parliamentary scrutiny through the timetable of this House and indeed using other scrutiny mechanisms. We've had the regular contributions from the Chair of the European Scrutiny Committee, and so it may not be beyond the wit of man to manage to do so. Again, I was slightly disappointed to see that the Honourable Member for Oldham and West Royton was not here to move his amendment, which I very much welcome the sentiment behind. For the government, to argue in the strongest possible terms within Europe for any measures that are there to reduce carbon emissions, to make sure they have to take into account that they should be sufficiently stringent to try and keep to a 2-degree rise in temperature if possible, and also to include the impact of aviation and shipping, does seem to be a very sensible thing. However, much as I welcome the sentiment of the amendment, I'm not really convinced this is the best way to go about it, but I would urge the Minister to press that point with his ministerial colleagues that, that a strong government line on this within Europe is obviously incredibly desirable. Similarly, on Amendments 66 and 284, it has given the opportunity for honourable members to raise concerns about the free market, but I'm not convinced that those concerns are necessarily best addressed through these particular amendments. So, in conclusion, Mrs Hill, I would hope that the Minister would look favourably on Amendments 42 to 47, and perhaps he might be able to reassure the House, or perhaps even stranger things might have happened to accept some of these amendments. I'm just coming to a conclusion, but of course I will come away.
She's gone pretty quickly through this. It's been quite difficult to follow her all the way through. Can she just be very clear what specifically she's looking for and what amendments are the Liberal Democrats likely to vote for in this set, please?
I will make it very clear, and I will be happy to repeat for the right honourable gentleman, of course, amendments 42 to 47, that would be inclusive. I feel very much minded to vote for it. I did say, with a slight caveat, that on amendment 47 in particular, we haven't heard from the Minister. I can't conceive of what argument he will possibly give that would mean that this change is not purely a clarifying change, but I do reserve the judgment to actually listen to what he says, which I think in this House is quite a useful thing to do sometimes within debate. So on that basis, I think I've set out clearly what I'm minded to do in the debates today, and I look forward to the other contributions in the debate.